You've got to be kidding me.
Basically wed bioethics with meta research, if that makes sense. My concern coming from bioethics is that my academic community is really not paying near enough attention to the issues that meta research is identifying. And so this, the slides and conversation we'll have today, it's sort of my attempt to try to make clear what the ethical consequences are, not only about the evidence that meta research is really churning out at a pretty impressive rate, I think, but also to the overall question of the trustworthiness of the biomedical research enterprise. And even though I'm going to use the term biomedical a lot, I think most of the things I'm talking about, they're going to be true certainly to all life sciences and behavioral research. Arguably, it may be less true with something like physics, but I think for most of the research going, and if there are any physicists here in the room, my apologies if I say anything too, well, actually, I just paid you a compliment, I think. But I think most of the issues that we'll talk about are, I think it would be clear to see how they're relevant to just about all the research that's going on here at UC Davis and most research institutions. So I'm going to start with a series of quotes about trust in science and scientific research. And this is, for those of you who don't know him, this is Richard Smith, who was the longtime editor of the British Medical Journal, now known as BMJ, and it's arguably one of the leading clinical research journals in the world. And he said, science depends wholly on trust. And I think this is taken from his blog. And I think he posted that in 2013. At about the same time, Nature, what's the year there? 2010, Nature had this lead editorial claiming that cultivating the public's trust must be the scientific community's top priority. And all the blue text, that's my emphasis being added there. Here's the head of the National Academy of Sciences at the time. This is 2010. All of these are around the same time. So scientists must do much more now and with urgency to demonstrate that science is indeed self-correcting and worthy of the public's trust. Anybody have any idea what the background story might have been here? What's going on? Climategate? Anybody remember the controversy? Climategate? The controversy around that erupted in the public when emails were hacked of climate scientists, and they were talking about how different ways they could essentially categorize their data that were very legitimate from a scientific point of view. What they were doing was completely legitimate, but from the public's point of view, it made it sound like people were just making up data. I think what the community was doing was there were gaps in years when data was available, so they were using sophisticated computer modeling to sort of fill in, that sort of anticipate what the data may have been in those years when they weren't able to generate data. I think I'm accurate in saying that, although I put an asterisk by it. But anyway, there were multiple investigations looking at those emails and whether or not it was an indication of any kind of scientific misconduct. And all the investigations exonerated all the people that were involved, but as is often the case, that part of the story never really filtered down into the public. But anyway, that's the backdrop for these quotes about trust. And then a little closer to home, this is Francis Collins, director of the NIH, who's still director of the NIH, says the public trust in what we do is just essential, and we cannot afford to take any chances with the integrity of the research process. And the backstory for this was very bad publicity about pharmaceutical companies funding to very generous funding of people's clinical research who were in positions of leadership to determine what the standard of care ought to be, or what practice guidelines ought to be for certain types of diseases and diagnoses. So again, there was a big public outcry, and this actually is the genesis for those of us who have to make we all have to make financial disclosures now, right, about any and all funding we get from our research, and it's really, this incidence is the main genesis of that new requirement. I point these out. I like to use these quotes for a couple of reasons. Number one is, even though all of these quotes sound like platitudes, and yes, even though they were issued when people or institutions were looking bad, what if they're nevertheless true? And I think most of us think these statements are true. Maybe we don't think that science depends wholly on trust, but I think we all think that science depends largely on trust, almost entirely on trust, right? We can modify that a little bit, but I think we believe it, right? And then the second point is that if we do believe that, and if it is true, why do we only focus on it when there are problems, as opposed to why don't we have a continuous focus on these issues? Yeah.
If I ask a question.
Sure,
So
yeah.
I'm sort of struggling with the premise. It seems to me that funding of science depends entirely on public trust, but science itself really only depends on integrity and honesty, not trust. Trust is at the whim of the public. If they choose not to believe climate science, it doesn't matter how honest we are.
Yeah. Well,
It's
and
the
I think,
funding that depends on the trust, but the
yeah,
process of science depends on the integrity of the practitioner.
I think maybe we're going where you're suggesting we should go, and that I think you just made a crucial distinction if you meant to, and it's one that I absolutely think is crucial and fundamental, and that is we should stop caring as much as we do about enjoying the trust of the public. And instead, we should be focusing much more on deserving the trust of the public. And I think if we can make that, even though it sounds like a subtle shift, I think it's a huge shift. I think it would redound much more to our credit than focusing on enjoying trust. And I think in my more cynical moments, when I look at the research enterprise as an enterprise, I think what they really care about, or what it really cares about, is enjoying trust. It's really not as curious as it should be about deserving trust. And so long as we lack that curiosity about how do we deserve trust, I'm not sure we're going to make as much progress as arguably we should be trying to make with some of these issues that the meta research community is calling to our attention. So I've sort of gone ahead a little bit, but I think I'm in good company by saying we need to focus on trustworthiness as opposed to trust. Leading theorists in trust and trustworthiness, Russell Hardin, sort of a seminal book on trust and trustworthiness, although it's a tough slog. I wouldn't recommend this lightly. But he says the best device for creating trust is to establish and support trustworthiness. This quote, all research subjects really want is to be able to trust the system. That's a quote from Paul Gelsinger. Does that name ring a bell to anyone? The name Jesse Gelsinger ring a bell to anyone? Jesse Gelsinger was a young man who, with an inherited genetic disease, who at the age of 17, I think, or 18, volunteered for a phase 1 clinical trial to test a new medication meant to genetically modify proteins in the body to provide a treatment for a very serious life-threatening disease that lacked credible or effective treatments. And he died on protocol. He didn't really qualify medically for the protocol, and he died as a result. And there was basically his death put a moratorium on all gene therapy research, clinical research in gene therapy in the US for quite a time. And looking back, reflecting, this is what his father said, is really all people want to be able to do is trust the system. And by the way, not to talk too much about the history here, but I think it is relevant for us still today. What really got to his father was the financial relationships between the principal investigator and Penn, which is where his biotech and intellectual property rights were essentially headquartered. And so you had an individual who was the principal investigator on the study, who owned like 30 or 40% of the company making the product. And the university where the research was being sponsored also had significant intellectual property rights in the company, which is what all of our research institutions do all the time, right? We've been doing it for a long, long time because Congress encourages us to do that. But when the public finds out about it, they get very, very nervous, right? And that's a bit of a sidetrack. But anyway, what I want to focus on is the extent to which our systems that we have in place that are driving research today, to what extent do they promote trustworthiness or detract from it? And I think it's always good to put human faces to these issues. So this is Raul Gonzalez and his daughter. I don't know if it's pronounced Lisbeth or Lisbeth, but there appeared in a feature story in the SAC-B a couple of years ago, and the occasion is her 15th birthday. So here's a proud father celebrating 15th birthday with his daughter. And here she is 1 year later, suffering from a juvenile Huntington's disease, an absolutely horrible disease for which there is no cure. Not only is there no cure, there's no effective treatment, right? And actually, this story was done to highlight some of the work going on at UC Davis to try to develop some new experimental approaches to treat Huntington's disease. And I think also it's good to keep some context in mind, and that is when we remember that the gene for Huntington's disease was discovered in 1993, and essentially today in 2018, we made zero progress. And I think that, calls for the question, why, right? Why have we made no progress? And it may be, in fact, many people, I think, could argue persuasively that the main reason we've made no progress is because it's just so damn complicated, right? Who knows how we can figure out the human brain and the central nervous system, which is where most of these problems generate, caused by this gene. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But on the other hand, when you look at all the excitement there is in the research community around genetics and genomics, right, single gene disorders are the low-hanging fruit. And here is one of several where we've virtually made no progress. And the question I like to derive from this is just, like I said, there are many, many causes for this. But one is I think we have to recognize that progress is certainly delayed if our systems aren't working and organized the way they should be in order to sort of match what I think is the talent and dedication of the individuals who are actually doing the research. Right? In other words, I'm trying to suggest that our systems are at least steering us, or since our systems may be steering us in the wrong direction in many ways, it's reasonable to assume that that contributes to the slow progress, the slow rate of progress. And if that's the case, right, then again, why aren't we doing more than we currently are to try to improve our systems? So I want to talk just very quickly about how the system is supposed to work. And again, I'm talking about biomedical research and how the system is supposed to take an idea from the lab to the bedside. So I'm really talking about sort of the oversight and regulatory system as opposed to the sequence of scientific research, but there's a lot of overlap. So Jesse Gelsinger, the young man who died in that phase 1 trial, like any and all research participants, should be approached to volunteer for a clinical trial if and only if certain conditions are met. One of those conditions is that there is sufficient scientific promise in something that people want to investigate, right? There needs to be a body of credible evidence to suggest that this, in fact, may be worthwhile to study in humans. And then based on that body of credible scientific evidence, you have to submit what's known as an IND, an investigative new drug application, to the FDA in the US, the European Medicines Agency in the EU. And you have to basically get permission from them to launch a clinical trial. And again, you have to present them with this body of credible evidence to persuade them that, yes, this might, in fact, be worth trying. Although I'll go ahead and say it now because I think it's relevant later. Really, what the FDA is focusing on with this evidence from preclinical research at this point is it going to be, if we put this in people, do we think it's going to be safe enough? They really do not look at efficacy. They look at safety. And if you go online to the FDA's website, it'll walk you through the process of an IND application. That's what you'll find, is that the data they want to see from preclinical efficacy studies is going to be safety data. All right, but that's the second step in the process. Next, it goes to an IRB. An IRB is not going to look at a candidate for clinical research unless there's an IND from the FDA, but the IND in and of itself is not enough. The IRB has to satisfy itself that the people who are going to be doing the research, they're minimizing the risk, the benefits of doing the research, the benefits to society of doing the research outweighs the risk to the participants, and then if you can pass that hurdle, then and only then can you approach someone like Jesse Gelsinger and his parents and ask them to volunteer for a trial. So that's the way the system is supposed to work. And sorry if that's too basic, too boring, too sort of underwhelming. But that's the system we have in place, right? That's the system that Jesse Gelsinger's father was saying, really all people want to know is that they can trust the system. So that's what I wanted to look at, is the extent to which we can trust the system. And again, people we are not supposed to let people enroll in trials unless they give adequate voluntary informed consent, which basically means that the investigators have a responsibility to tell research candidates anything and everything they need to know in order to make a smart decision about whether or not they want to volunteer. Okay, so that's how the system works, right? It starts with preclinical basic research and ends with the informed consent process, with critical steps in between. So, how's the system working? How good of a job can the FDA do in reviewing a new drug application if the studies that they're looking at don't meet certain minimal requirements of quality? What if they're preclinical animal studies? What if they use 5 animals, 6 animals? What if there's no randomization? What if the investigators aren't blinded? What if those studies themselves are not repeated or replicated by a different independent lab. What does it say about the FDA's ability to make a good decision for the system to work the way the public, rightly or wrongly, I think the public expects the system to work, right? If you or a close friend of yours, a loved one of yours is asked to volunteer on a clinical trial, right? You want to think that, you know, I should not be asked to do this unless, you know, certain conditions were met. Of course, you know, we got documentation out the wazoo, right? That all of the problems I just listed that we can find with preclinical studies, that they're common problems, right? Just to highlight some of that, I imagine everybody in this group is familiar with this article, right? It was interesting at noon today, I was given a somewhat similar talk in the campus RCR program. And there were maybe 35, 40 people in the audience. Only 3 or 4 people were familiar with this article. It really surprised me, because I think it's been downloaded over 1 million times now. So, but anyway, right? I mean, this is a huge red flag when it comes to the reliability of the preclinical research that's being used for FDA applications. You've probably all seen this survey results published in Nature about a year ago that shows that 90% of people in the research, does anybody remember who was sampled? I think it was all biological researchers, right?
At least all like physical and natural sciences, maybe.
Yeah, asking, you know, do you think there's a reproducibility crisis? And here we see that, you know, over half said, not only is there a crisis, but it's an important crisis, right? The rest said yes, but it's not, it's just slight, right? So, I mean, yeah. So I guess you can interpret this any way you want to, but I don't know about, I mean, crisis is sort of either it's a crisis or it's not. I'm not sure crisis admits of degrees, but we can let the linguists figure that one out. But again, you know, just a lot of aggregate data demonstrating problems that we have in preclinical research. It's not as if people don't know about these problems, right? And that people have been trying to do things to change the situation. Anybody in here familiar with the ARRIVE guidelines? Yeah, at least one of us. Issued or developed in 2010, now endorsed by more than 1,000 scientific journals. And what the ARRIVE guidelines do, in other words, it's sort of a voluntary system, I think, right? Where people are supposed to, within their labs, say, we're going to follow the ARRIVE guidelines, which really are, I think they focus primarily on research design issues, such as the importance of having control groups, random assignment, advanced calculation of sample size, tracking what are you going to do with animals that are dropped from analysis. These really sort of basic considerations. They were promulgated in 2010. Elsevier in 2013 wanted to look at the animal studies. I think this study, just looking at the animal studies that they were publishing in some of their family of journals. I don't think this was all journals. I think it was just Elsevier journals. And what they found was there was no blinding in almost 90% of the published studies. And then just a few months ago, there was an article in Science that looked at, I think in Chicago this past fall, there was a World Congress on Peer Review. I think every couple of years there's a big international conference on peer review. And there were 2 or 3 posters that were studying the ARRIVE guidelines and the extent to which people were aware of them, following them. And what they found was that most researchers are either they continue to be unaware of them, or if they are aware of them, they're not really making concerted efforts to follow them. So yeah, I think that poses to me, a really interesting question about the system, right? What is it about the system that we can document the significant problems that have been documented to the extent that they've been documented, but it's not. And we developed some fairly straightforward, although I know nothing's really straightforward and there can be a lot of expense involved, but we have mechanisms identified that could help improve upon the status quo, but they're basically just being ignored. And also, this does have these problems with respect to the quality of preclinical research. They do have human consequences. At least that's the take-home message I take from this study, which was an evaluation of excess significance bias in animal studies of neurological diseases. This was published, I think, in 2013. It looked at 160 meta-analyses of animal studies related to 6 different neurological disorders. The study meta-analysis looked at almost 4,500 different animal studies that helped provide the scientific foundation for 160 candidate treatments of neurological disorders that were then studied in clinical trials. And they found significant excess significance bias. Almost over 1,700 of these 4,500, almost 4,500 animal studies had a positive result, whereas the authors thought really all you should, given what we know about science, you really should only expect about 900 to a priori be expected to have such high significance findings. But I think what's more important is because of the extent of excess significance bias, these authors concluded that there should have never been 160 clinical trials of these candidate treatments. If you only go by what they thought was the solid science, really only about 8 of the 160 clinical trials should have been conducted. So if you agree with their analysis, they're saying that all of the people in 152 of these 160 clinical trials should never have been approached to volunteer for those trials and expose themselves to risk as a result of volunteering. I think we can interpret that various ways. I think if we had different patient advocacy groups out here who are desperate for new and effective treatments, they're going to want to try anything that we can, right? But if we think the system has merit and that there should be a science hurdle that studies have to clear before we start clinical trials, and I think it's hard to argue otherwise from a professionalism point of view, right? Why would scientists want to study things that are not demonstrably worth studying, right? Especially when it involves exposing people to risk. If that's our take, then I think this is a troubling conclusion that these authors draw. So much for that circle. What about this one? What if the FDA doesn't get access to all the data that would shed light on the quality of science that's being used to support an application? And usually these data are proprietary. And FDA, there's only so much they can do to demand that all the data be turned over as opposed to some kind of cherry picking.
I was just going to make a comment that I suppose it's only fair to say that since the authors of that article felt in their judgment was that 8 of the 160 should have been done, but that too is an observation that requires reproducibility, and others looking at those same data might come up with a different number.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think that's a fascinating question. I don't know if you all thought or talked about this as a group before or not, but meta research itself is a fairly new field, right? How good are our methods in study design, right? Can they be improved? Since I'm not qualified to do that kind of research, I guess I don't feel like I need to be able to answer the question, but I have talked to some people who do a lot of meta research, and they really, at least the few people I've talked to, they really struggle with this, right? Is our science any better than the science that our science is, is casting? And sometimes they're not very flattering light. So I think that's a critical point that we need to keep in mind. So now let's look at the IRB process, right? What if an IRB rely on studies whose reports or whose results weren't independently verified? And we know that happens. You can get an IND from the FDA based on one study, one animal study. So, what should an IRB do with that, right? If it's their job to only approve studies where they think there's adequate scientific information available to show that the benefits outweigh the risks, but there's maybe only one study that was not independently verified, should they be approving that study? I want to give you a little bit of data about this, and I don't know if there are any IRB members. Anybody on the IRB? Okay. For clinical research or social science?
Clinical research.
Clinical research. Did you remember any conversations at committee meetings drilling down into the preclinical efficacy studies and asking if they had been blinded, had others independently arrived at the same results?
I served two tours of duty in the early 90s that came up.
Yeah.
But in the 2000s, late 2000s, 10 years ago, there was a lot more scrutiny of the rationale and the justification, not just the proximate ethical issues.
Mm-hmm.
More of a focus on, is this worth doing?
Yeah.
We really know what to say.
But in conversations about
preclinical stuff, you know how the committee works. I mean, they give primary review responsibility to someone who's kind of has expertise in that area.
and you get a secretary this high, right?
Yeah. And I always would read the animal studies because they gave me research projects in my area. I wanted to know what was going on. Yeah. So it wasn't usually discussed, and what it would be if the primary reviewer had a problem with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't remember that being.
Yeah. Yeah, so basically you're saying the system is, and I think that's probably true of most IRBs, maybe there are some outliers out there, but mainly we rely on one or two reviewers, right, to catch something in the information that's brought to them in the packet that the IRB requests. Well, there's actually a way that this is supposed to work, and probably part of what was in your packet was what's called investigation brochures that the sponsors had to put together that essentially was a summary of the preclinical efficacy studies. And here's what the guidelines say that an investigator brochure summary is supposed to do. Summary of the preclinical efficacy studies. It says the brochure should, quote, be presented in a concise, simple, objective, balanced, and non-promotional form that enables a clinician or potential investigator to, and in other words, if I'm a physician and I have an opportunity to ask some of my patients to enroll in the trial, these investigator brochures are supposed to give me balanced, unbiased information so that I can learn about the science underlying the trial. And IRBs have access to these same brochures, so that they can make their own unbiased risk-benefit assessment of the appropriateness of the proposed trial. That's the way the system is supposed to work. I don't know that these data, I'm not going to give you a whole bunch of data, but they may literally be hot off the press. I don't know if this study has been posted online yet in PLOS Biology. It was just accepted for publication within the last 3 weeks, I think. But to my knowledge, this is the only study that actually looks at the relationship between investigator brochures summarizing preclinical efficacy studies and IRBs. So this was a study of 3 different IRBs in Germany, looking at 708 preclinical efficacy studies referenced in 109 investigator brochures for phase 1 and phase 2 studies. If you're not familiar with the different phases of study, phase 1 primarily focuses on, is a new drug or device safe? And if it passes phase 1, yes, this is safe enough to try in people. Then phase 2 begins to look at efficacy. So these are clinical trials at the very early stages. What they found was that less than 5% of these preclinical efficacy studies cited in the investigator brochures described evidence about such basic features as randomization, sample size calculation, and blinded outcome assessment.
So if you're not saying that 5% of the brochures, if the 5% of the studies themselves that are cited in the brochures, even when you go to the study, you can't.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, you know, that's what people are asked to rely upon, right? So the authors concluded that most investigator brochures for phase 1-2 studies did not allow evaluators to systematically appraise the strength of the supporting preclinical findings.
But so this isn't a problem with the brochures, but with the papers that the brochures are relying on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and probably a bit of context. I meant to say this earlier, but I didn't remember to do it. Remember, let's say you have the universe of preclinical studies, and if Ioannidis is correct, the findings in at least half of them, more than half, are false, right? Well, maybe that's not all that troubling if our clinical trials are based on that smaller subset of scientific qualities that are not subject, right, to these quality problems. And this is a way to try to interrogate that, right? And what this study is suggesting is that there's no reason to think that these preclinical efficacy studies are exempt or largely exempt from the quality issues that are of concern to us. So I hope you see where I'm going with this, right? Is that how trustworthy are our risk-benefit assessments that our IRBs are making? And I recognize sort of the difficulty that would be placed on IRBs if they really drill down this deeply, right, to find out, to actually go back to the actual studies and the publications of those studies that is the scientific basis for a protocol. But if no one is doing that, then can Jesse Gelsinger's father trust the system, right? Because this is what we're telling the public the system is doing.
Well, I agree with most of what you're saying, but I think it's a little oversimplified.
Okay.
That there are elements of these non-randomized, unblinded preclinical studies that either that independently suggest validity or lack of validity, that aren't captured by these criteria that meta-scientists look at. And you know,
so those other criteria could perhaps outweigh these problematic features.
That go as far as outweigh, but they're unweighed here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And they're the kinds of things that clinical research. You know, you have physicians who have a more of a right brain approach for answering some questions, and then a more systematic linear analysis approach for answering other kinds of questions. They use both of those to evaluate data. And you don't really capture, like, you know, if in a rat study they included an arm with a drug that's well known not to work, or contrast that control arm with a drug that's well known to work, and the proposed new drug looks like that one.
That's a much better study, right?
That gives you a good feeling.
Yeah.
That you can make a decision. even if they weren't randomized or something, it's just an element.
Yeah.
And for some diseases, there aren't any drugs like that. So
Yeah.
they're really out to lunch. But there is kind of maybe an empirical way to assess the value of different approaches, which is like when there was only 8 of 160 clinical trials based on animal work, what were the results of those other 152 clinical trials? Did any of them actually produce
That's a good question.
improvement in clinical outcome? I mean, how about versus the 8? Is
I don't
is
know.
there an efficacy signal?
I don't know if the study talked about that. It's been a couple of years since I read it carefully. So I'll have to go back and look at it, or at least contact the authors to see if they asked that question.
It's not to be too abstract about these things, because at least in medical science, after 10 to 15 years, we know if they work or not.
Well, yeah, but that brings up a whole nother set of problems that arguably are not quite as widespread, but it is documented in the literature that we can continue to have clinical trials studying drugs that we've known for 10 years work fine. But for whatever reason, people continue to have randomized clinical trials, which means that some people get randomized away from a drug that we already know works, which is a whole other set of problems. But I think your point is absolutely critical, and I certainly don't mean to suggest that IRB members don't take these matters seriously, right? And that they don't bring a sort of sophisticated, contextualized knowledge to their review. However, right, it's still the case that we don't have as much information as we need to have to be able to assess the quality of those studies. And so the point of this is 2 points from this study. One is that we have to at least put an asterisk around the adequacy of our efforts to weigh benefits against risks. And then part 2, I'll go to in a second.
I was just going to say, a lot of the studies not all of them, but in the investigational procedures are published. And they give you the citation, and sometimes you go read the paper, find out what was the quality. Usually published papers, even then they don't always have.
Well, exactly. Yeah, that's the problem you're often going to run into. Right? There's not enough in the methods section to really answer these questions. All right. Well, now we're down to the last part of the system, I think, which is the informed consent process, right? Because I think I said what the informed consent process is supposed to do is give people the information they would need to know in order to decide whether they do or do not want to volunteer for the study. And what you're going to find in informed consent documents is very specific information about what the anticipated risks are, the severity of those risks, what efforts might be available to minimize or address those risks if they occur, as well as what we think the anticipated benefits are. There will be very descriptive language in there. What's not going to be in there, and I would argue it's relevant information that should be in there, is the degree of uncertainty there is about those benefits and those risks because of what we do not know about the quality of the science. And the informed consent process completely masks the degree of uncertainty that there can be. Now, you're required to find statements in there saying there may be risks that we don't know about, that we haven't mentioned, that can occur, and these can be serious. So people are told that. But at the same time, they're given an official document stating what the known risks and benefits are. And that's sort of, I would argue, that's an implicit endorsement of the accuracy of that information. with no disclosure about, it's not all that clear how accurate this information is that we're providing to you. So I think the point of the bubbles is that at every step of the process, I think there's evidence to show that there are real questions we need to be raising about the extent to which the system is working. So to sort of summarize, if it's the case that progress requires reliable systems, and if it's the case that volunteers should be able to trust that the system is working, then it seems we need to be improving our systems to make them more trustworthy than they currently are. And I don't mean to appear naive in saying that, so I need to make this picture bigger. It's just a nice stream flowing in a field somewhere. But I would argue that there's an analogy between the flow of water in this field, and science, the science that we're producing, right? The water really the lay of the land dictates where the water goes. And I think our systems that we have in place dictate the kind of science that we get. So if you think that any of these problems I've identified are in fact problems that we should be doing something about, we're probably not going to be able to do anything about them unless we, bring in some landscape architects and completely redo many of the contours of science. And I know that sounds hopeless and naive, but I think that is essentially the task that we're confronted with, which I think takes me back to one of the questions. I talked some with Celine about this, but one of the things I always focus on is, why aren't these issues getting more attention and focus than they currently are? Now, if my analysis is way off base and the problems are nowhere near as extensive or significant as I try to present them as being, then maybe I shouldn't worry so much. But I do agree with almost everything I've said. So I think we should be paying more attention to this, which poses the question: how in the world do we get the research community to focus more on this? To focus less on simply wanting the public's trust and more on actually deserving trust. So, yeah.
It's really interesting. So I have a couple of thoughts I think are related to each other. I'm not sure if I'll be able to put them all in one point. But the last point about the informed consent makes me think of, I just recently finally, wrapped my head around the main point of Paper-Unser's argument about reasoning under uncertainty. I don't know if you're familiar with this idea that we present a lot of things as if they're questions about risk and probabilities, when in fact we don't even know what we should be, which potential benefits or risks there are, and how we should assign probabilities to them, and so on. And that actually we're often operating in a context of uncertainty where these probabilities we can't really get a handle on. And so I was thinking one option would be to require consent forms to do away with that language entirely and really just say that we have no idea.
We have no idea.
Which more along those lines.
Yeah.
Or to be more precise, to force consent forms to another direction, to be more precise and really put numerical probabilities, like basically force researchers to put priors on what they think that the outcomes are likely to be, and then hold them accountable if the posteriors don't match those over many studies or over long term, right? It's okay if you're off sometimes, but basically, if you're going to be talking as if we have clear ideas about the risks and the probabilities of those risks,
then be transparent about why we think
it accountable, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess a couple of things. One is, and I think you were getting at this already, is also we have to recognize that disclosure itself can be extremely ineffective, right? So even if we are more transparent, at the end of the day, is it going to matter to people's actual decision making? In terms of the first approach, just don't say any of this. We couldn't do that today under the current regulatory scheme, right? The federal government requires us to make those kinds of assessments. So that's going to be difficult. my own sort of proposed solution with informed consent and a lot of these things is that I think IRBs should require much, I agree with your second take on this. We should require much more specific disclosures about these things. People submitting their protocols to the IRBs, they need to be interrogated about these preclinical efficacy studies, right? What is the quality? What do you know about the quality? And if you don't know anything about the quality, we'll come back to us once you have learned something. I know, people aren't going to want to do that, but I think that's one requirement. And then sort of be as clear as we possibly can to research candidates about the extent to what we don't know, right? And what we know about the provenance of the information that leads us to believe that we do know some things, right? Because again, the consent process, I would argue it conceals all of that information. Not deliberately, but because of our guidelines that says what needs to be informed consent, none of this stuff fits. So.
This has been really interesting to me. It's like confusing that people recruiting for the study are doing the study, right? So those that are giving you this disclosure information are also the ones that are going to be.
Well, sometimes we have sort of study coordinators or people who aren't specifically associated with the study doing recruiting. That's not always the case, but yeah.
So it's not routine to have, say, a third party that's where
no, it's not going to be routine.
Enrollment happens, but there's not that additional level of assessment and scrutiny that there's not. Or that just ensures that all potential participants are given access to the same level of quality.
Well, I think most IRBs today could make a pretty compelling case that of the things they are required to disclose, they're doing a good job of it, number one. Number two, they also recognize that informed consent is not simply a bunch of words on a piece of paper, it's a communication process. And we try to have that process be such that it encourages people to ask questions, we bring in neutral third parties when we really think there's a compelling reason to do so.
Okay, I guess that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, but
and then this is not my area of research, but that deciding whether to enroll in a study or not, if I'm eligible, actually, for better or worse, I probably rely on my doctor.
Yeah.
The one that's involved in the study, what they think, if they're convincing me I should do this versus just numbers on page, because I know the numbers could be meaningless.
And what you're referring to is a huge problem in clinical research. I mean, here we're talking about, or I should have said, even if we have all of these wonderful disclosures I'm saying we're having, it's not at all clear that at the end of the day it will make a difference. The reason I say that is we have very good documentation of what's called both therapeutic misestimation and therapeutic misconception. Most of us think, why would my doctor or my nurse, who I've been coming to see for the last 15 years to treat my blood pressure, my high blood pressure, why would they be asking me to do something if it's not in my health benefit for me to do, right? We simply do not recognize the difference between research and clinical care. That's the therapeutic misconception. Therapeutic misestimation, and there are lots of reasons for this probably, but for whatever reason, we tend to overestimate the chances that something is going to work, right? Just again, aggregate data, only 5% of new drugs that make it into a phase 1 to the phase 1 stage ends up being approved by the FDA. 95% failure rate, but
is that part of the informed consent process? Why not?
I think it should be. I think it should be. But, well,
yeah. Well, I don't really.
Yeah, I don't think it's
phase 1 is a whole different thing.
Yeah, I've never seen that in there. There's always a statement to the fact that, well, in a phase 1 trial, there's going to be language that this will be of no benefit.
People who've ever been given this drug.
Yeah,
We'll say that.
and not only that, we're not looking to see if it works. We're only looking to see if it's safe, right? So all of that's simple.
The base rates about how often the outcome of that study is that it is safe, but it's not safe, and how often it goes on to phase 2, and how
Yeah.
I think all of that would be relevant.
Yeah. Well, I have to share my manuscript with you on how to improve the informed consent process.
I mean, there are a lot of other issues, though, right? I mean, for example, much of the research that's available by IRB has nothing to do with the trial. I mean, if I want to collect a blood sample from somebody who's going for endoscopy, I have to write an IRB proposal to do that. And
yeah, if it's human subjects, right, you have
and there's no discussion of benefit, not a drug, not treatment. Just saying, I want a sample of blood from you. It's, you know, there's a very small chance I could hurt you by doing that, but that's end of story. I mean, there's not much more to it than that. And then also, I think that another issue, I mean, one of many other issues, is that it depends a lot on what you're talking about. I mean, if you're talking about a drug, giving you a new drug that's going to maybe make your cholesterol a bit better than it was on the old drug, that's one thing, and, you know, or a vaccination for a disease that you'll probably never get, you know, but that's very different than you have, you know, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, 3-month life expectancy, you know, I mean, where do you set the bar in terms of the data that you require before you're willing to try that?
Yeah.
I mean, those are very, very different scenarios.
Does that come in?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I guess I alluded to this already, but I think what interests me about that scenario you just presented is what is the level of scientific justification we as a research community need to impose upon ourselves about when it's okay to launch a phase 1 trial, given all we know about arguably the ineffectiveness of the informed consent process combined with the desperation of certain research populations. We know, like, Lisbeth's parents will agree to anything. There is virtually no chance that they will say no when presented with the phase 1 trial. Well, in light of that, does that alter our independent scientific responsibilities? Yeah.
So I thought phase 1 was always in healthy volunteers.
No.
So some are in.
Some are in sick people because the things that are being tested are so toxic.
Yeah, so they already know they're toxic.
Yeah.
They don't have to test it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And have a sense of
Yeah. Yeah.
which is most of the volunteers.
Yeah, you're right. The vast majority of phase 1 trials are in some sort of, you know, I'm going to say inpatient facilities, but there's sort of, you know, these big dormitories where people go for the money, right, to take new drugs. So like you couldn't do that with the new drug being tested on
Because
TCLs.
It seems like there are some things here that are tackleable, very tackleable right now, like transparency. Report what you did.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be hard to find out if there was a control and what the control was, and if it was blind or not. Like, regardless of whether it should be blind, and you couldn't make it blind, but that transparency should be there.
And also, I think, not to focus too much on IRBs and informed consent, but I think there's a good reason for focusing on them, because again, if you agree that there are systems level problems, right, that it's going to be difficult to do anything about, we need a point of leverage. And every clinical, and IRBs and the informed consent process are arguably ideal points of leverage, because all studies have to go through those two, right? And lesser issues that I think we might be able to make a lot of progress around. One of the lesser issues being the fact that study results aren't published.
I was going to ask about pre-registration. Is that?
Well, if it's true that 95% of drugs that get studied, only 5% that make it through phase 1 make it all the way through. We know in advance that for the majority of clinical trials, the benefit of those trials is learning that something doesn't work. That's the benefit.
Or that it's toxic.
Or that it's toxic, right? And that benefit is not possible if you do not publish the results, or if you only publish possible results. What if we put in our consent forms, or well, what if IRBs would only approve studies if you could document and be held accountable for publishing the results, or if an IRB doesn't want to be that heavy-handed, at least require a statement that says, you know, the most likely benefit is that we're going to learn something doesn't work or it's too toxic. And we know that most studies the results are not published or published in full, and we don't know whether or not your investigator is going to bother to publish it. I think we'd be too ashamed to put that in consent forms. Or if we did, I think people would read that part of the consent form because it's so at odds with the information they're expecting to see. I think that's an example of pretty low-hanging fruit where we could use the IRB and informed consent processes to try to bring about some important reforms.
Do stage 1 trials have to be registered as clinical trials? So they are registered.
Well, they're supposed to be.
And there's a lot of outcomes to change.
Yeah, and the whole, and clinicaltrials.gov, that's a total, it's like completely on the honor system. You know, people go in, they enter their studies, and you can, I mean, it's a good database to have, but it also lends itself to abuse. I'll give you an example of that. If you're familiar with stem cell clinics that are proliferating all over the world, including in the US and California, pushing unproven, scientifically dubious stem cell treatments on people. These clinics point to the fact that this is a clinical trial, and they will link to it on clinicaltrials.gov. And it's a totally bogus trial. You can find, I've seen a phase 1 trial for stem cell treatments that are studying like 500 different conditions. Well, there's no way to do that, you know, in the phase 1 study. And one of the things they're studying is people's quality of life. Or can we put an IV, can we give someone a shot? You know, it's one of their study endpoints in a phase. So you know, so again, it's transparency is helpful in some ways, but you know, well, I think I'm glad you brought that up because I think it raises another interesting and intrinsic challenge to systems level changes. Right? How do we design changes that do good things, that do more good things than bad things, right?
Yeah, and going back to the question the guy who left asked about, you know, if I'm just taking your blood and that's it, then the only potential harm is I may hurt you. But that's not true if you're going to cherry pick the results or not publish them at all if you don't like them or whatever.
Yeah.
The first time I heard you talk about it, that really stuck with me that participants may actually, even in very low stakes research like social psychology, they may not want to give 20 minutes of their time and some credibility with like a larger sample or whatever to the researcher who isn't going to commit to publishing the result no matter what or pre-specifying their prediction or analysis. And so, yeah, I think that most participants, it would be really interesting to do a survey of this, of participants and ask them, would it matter to you if the results will be cherry-picked, if they'll be filed, or if the data will be made publicly available or not. And there's a lot of kind of speculating about participants wouldn't want their data to be publicly available. Well, maybe they wouldn't want it to not be publicly available.
Yeah.
Because, you know, not very sensitive data. So I think a data-driven approach to what should be in consent forms.
It would be very interesting.
Really interesting, and I think that at least the cherry picking and file drawing, it would shock me if participants didn't care about that and wouldn't want that information, even when there's no other potential harm.
Yeah. A couple of studies come to mind when you say that, and I think they're somewhat at odds with one another. There has been some empirical study of people's attitudes about financial conflicts of interest of clinical investigators. And a significant subset of respondents interpreted the fact that a clinician got a lot of money from private industry, and I'm not sure if this is a bad conclusion to draw, they saw that as a good thing. He or she must know what they're doing, right? They're a recognized expert. Why else would they be getting this money from the sponsors? So there's, there's that side, or I don't know if that data is relevant or not. Another set of data that may be more relevant is there was a study that looked at people who had participated in clinical research and IRB members and asked them would they like to know about the commercial purposes of research? Is this clinical trial being done to tweak a patent, sort of evergreen studies, if you will, right? A patent is going to expire. The sponsor is going to lose, hundreds of millions of dollars a year if they can't extend the patent. Well, let's make a very minor change that is going to require a clinical trial. And basically, the reason that study is being done is to extend the patent. It's not really being done to improve healthcare, which I think is what the assumption most people take into the decision to volunteer to be in the clinical trial. And at least that one study showed that people absolutely thought that commercial information was relevant to the informed consent process. And you don't see that in consent.
What if the informed consent, the study's being done so the person can get tenure, but actually they don't really care?
Yeah.
Or it's part of your dissertation.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's, conflict of interest is a really tough topic to tackle. And, I think we put way too much emphasis on financial conflicts of interest at the expense of these other more prevalent conflicts that are always there. And just because they're there doesn't mean they can't be managed, right? But we don't focus on them because nobody makes us focus on them. Again, it's a systems issue, right? The system is focusing on financial relationships, which arguably, right, if we're worried about doing biased science, many things besides financial relationships have the potential to introduce bias, but we only focus on one little piece of the puzzle.
So I'm curious, for the IRB, it's the PIs or the team in general, is their past IRB status considerable? Is their past IRB status? So for instance, like if you go to apply for an MSF grant, you have to list all of your prior support. With your IRB though, I don't remember if there's any list prior proposals or an outcome of prior research at all. Like there's no.
I mean, they have records of these
Yeah.
things, and if you have been a problem PI, and there are many,
Yeah.
they know
that,
about it.
that history will follow you. I think
And
also,
they are more scrutinized, people who've not been straightforward with that, so you've got near that edge of the application.
and I think,
There's no reporting mechanism there, but it's just saying in order to get your next IRB, you need to tell us what happened with your last one.
well, yeah, you can do that, right? People aren't going to like it, but it's something to do.
And I like the idea of intervening at the level of the local IRB because it's more you can
Yeah.
actually see something change. The IRB is a professional organization
Mhm.
interested in these questions.
Yeah. But of course, one of the big pushes from NIH these days and elsewhere, at least for multi-center trials, is do away with local IRBs.
Yeah.
It's have to centralize.
Sort of inefficient.
Yeah. But you lose, right, all that local knowledge, which can be very relevant to the review.
Because it's only up to the NIH in terms of the whole institution.
Yeah.
It's an institutional choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I like the idea of asking PIs to comment on their priors, like
Mm-hmm.
someone mentioned. I mean, when you review funding applications and study sections, that's the key thing that you summarize as an expert reviewer is what's the likely impact of this research
Based on
what's been
Yeah.
presented and,
Yeah.
and what hasn't been presented that you happen to know.
Well, I think it's true that IRBs, you have to keep a current CV on file. I don't know if that would have the information.
Well, I mean, when if you're proposing to do a local site of a big pharma study at UC Davis Medical Center, and the PI, you've read the investigator's brochure, you've heard about this drug coming down the pipeline, and now here it is ready for a phase 2 trial in Sacramento. You have the investigator has a pretty good idea if this is a high upside to this new drug. There hasn't been one like this before. This could really be different and special, or this is a lot like the other 8 drugs we have. It might be a little less toxic.
Yeah.
But the upside is small. I mean, that's the impact.
Yeah.
Then there's also the likelihood. Is it really going to work? What does the preclinical data look like?
And about 75% of new drugs that are approved on a non-inferiority basis, as opposed to superiority. Which again, it's not clear to the public.
That's actually fairly uncontentious. Most people who are expert in the field know that. They can make that distinction. Okay. That ought to be, when you submit a protocol there, it's 20 questions you have to answer. Right? That ought to be one of them. What's the likely impact it's successful?
Yeah.
Well, it's just a Me Too drug.
Yeah. But of course, you don't see that in the consent form, right? This is really not that important.
That would be the next step. The first step is elect.
Yeah.
Because they might not otherwise. And
yeah.
then maybe later put it on the consent form.
Yeah. That's also on my list of proposed changes to the informed consent process. So, again, be more transparent about this. Because again, it's not clear either that IRD members or research candidates would tolerate some of the problems that we are documenting in the system. And so again, that's why I think they're an interesting point of leverage to try to test. Well, appreciate the chance to talk about this. Happy to answer any other questions. Maybe people want to sign off. Or I guess they can sign off at any time.
I actually would encourage everyone to the NIH just recently released a request for comments on the strategic plan, which actually reads a lot like an management plan dealing with aligning lots of different data streams from NIH funded research, including clinical work. So if you're interested, take a look at that and see. I'd be curious to hear from a data ethics standpoint and these issues, if something pops out of you that is capturing or you feel like it's lacking consideration. Mostly the language that I was looking at in it talks about security concerns. There's a lot more that goes into this.
Yeah.
Just making sure